Hello, and thank you. So this picture has no relation to the talk. I just put it up because it's nice. I'm Florian, and this joke never gets old. Everyone who saw me 2 years ago. If you want to be me, just put this in your profile, evaluate it, and your Git behaves like mine. I run the RubyConf conference that Michelle was so kindly speaking about this morning, and that she is going back to this year, and you saw her talk first. I also run the RubyConf conference, which is running on the same date. The call of paper closes tomorrow, so please all leave the room, submit a paper. And so 2 years ago, in October 2012, in a city far away, actually Buenos Aires, I said, in 5 or 10 years, none of us will program like today. And I thought it might be a good idea to just take that and submit a talk to this very conference, taking that a bit further. Sadly, I found out, and I called it Ruby through the crystal ball. Sadly, I found out there are a lot of issues with future telling. And the first is, if it's accurate, it's trivial. I love British rock music, and there's this nice line by Future of Left. I have seen into the future. Everyone is slightly older. That's what you get if you actually try to be accurate. Pody hates spoilers like hell, so also, by telling the future, I would spoil the future for him. And while I was preparing the talk, it's incredibly biased. You constantly introduce your wishes about the future into trying to do something that is not as biased as you'd like to. And so it turned out I had no idea what I was doing. I scrapped my talk 2 days ago, and I'm not going to hold it. On the other hand, I do prepare my slides on paper nowadays. And so I sat on my paper and searched for, well, can I kind of get something out of this? And I had this word in the center. And I would never have found that out if I had put it in Keynote already. So this talk is called Space. Now, there's a very good book by Alistair Reynolds that is called House of Suns. If one of the shortest descriptions is it's a story that takes around 100,000 years, if that doesn't hook you, don't read it. If it hooks you, read it. And he speaks about 2 ways of immortality in this book. And one of those ways is time dilation. Basically, there are groups in this universe that survive by prolonging time as much as possible and only waking up every few 100,000 years, basically trying to figure out what happened and acting on that, which in technology terms could be something like SGML, HTML, and XHTML. And the other group, there's the other way of constant growth. So there are civilizations that grow literally constantly in size and need to grow into new spaces. So they need to occupy space. They need to move into new space. So as a Ruby community, what spaces do we have already? Which ones are we moving to? And the first question to answer for that is, are we actually moving? Because sometimes, like if I take Ruby from the last half year and today, it feels like not a lot has changed. So maybe we have to have a look at the broader scope. And while preparing the initial version of this talk, I came across this quote. If there's a primary thrust to Ruby, it is duck typing. Can anyone imagine which Ruby we're talking about? That's actually why speaking about Ruby 1.8.0. And I find that quite interesting because if you imagine, today, everyone who's talking about Ruby is like, Ruby, that's the language where you practice duck typing. But 10 years ago, that wasn't set. Like, it wasn't even the core team envisioning that language didn't accept duck typing as a standard way of handling in that language back then. So this indicates how far we have become. It's pretty standard nowadays and accepted that this is the way to handle this language. Back then, that wasn't clear at all. So what was growing back then? We had quickly thereafter, also in 2004, Rails moving into the same MVC framework space and later turning into a REST framework, the first versions of Rails might have been close to REST, but weren't actually in any ways geared toward it. Well, and the space of blocks in 50 minutes. And we might laugh about that today, but a framework that could be set up, configured, and you built something usable in it in 15 minutes was something pretty mind-blowing back then. And we also had Rake that only then started to actually create internal DSLs in Ruby. Nowadays, everyone is like, Ruby, that's the thing with the DSLs. Back then, not at all. So yes, we're moving. So where's our core technology moving? And where is it currently? So the first question is, which spaces are filled? And I'd like to speak about 4 projects: MRI, JRuby, mRuby, and RubyMotion. And MRI is pretty clearly the standard Ruby interpreter. And it will stay so. It has stayed so for the last 5 years. It will stay so for the next 5 years. It has a stable release cycle every 24th or 25th of December. It sees constant development, and usually the next version is better than the last one. It's not all gold, but it's getting better. And it is, and has always been, a pretty good Unix scripting interpreter that was very usable in a Unix environment. For those that don't care about Unix that much, we have JRuby, which is a serious stable implementation, is compatible with Ruby at 1.8 still, 1.9 and 2.0, partially, but close currently. It is a very sane implementation. It is a fast implementation. And it heals your JVM allergy if you have it. There's also Ruboto, which is basically JRuby on Android. If that's of interest to you, you should have a look at it. And which spaces are we moving into with our interpreters? There's mRuby. I don't know. Has anyone here tried mRuby once? Okay. For those that don't know, mRuby is actually a new project by Matt. It's not that new anymore, 3 or 4 years, which is a very minimal Ruby interpreter that is very modular, that basically moves into the Lua space. It ships without a standard lib. It is very well embeddable. And because of that, it's actually usable on mobile phones, also because of the low memory footprint, and, for example, well, on iOS or Android. And there's RubyMotion, which is another pretty popular framework. Sadly, it's not open source, which is Ruby for Cocoa runtimes on iOS and Mac OS X, taking up the iOS space. So what are the open opportunities here? I think one thing that we haven't covered at all as a community is casual Ruby. Ruby for people that just want to use it because of one project solving one of their needs. And we see that problem a lot. Like one of the jokes from yesterday was kind of like this. If you want to install Node, like if you install Node on Ubuntu, you first figure out that Node isn't called Node on Ubuntu. Then you install Node.js. Then you install a package manager. And then you install package manager using the package manager. There's another joke if Rubyists start to try using Python, which kind of starts like this. There's another joke if Node.js people and Python people start to use Ruby, especially on the Mac, it starts like this. Download Xcode, install RVM, install Homebrew, install RVM. This is not for the casual user, clearly. All these environments suck for people that just want to use a tiny program in Node.js, Python, or Ruby. It's actually all the same, because all of these communities basically assume that you went through all the hassle of setting up an environment. But we do have casual software. We do have Middleman, which is a very good static site generator and a very clean one. We do have Sass, which is used in many projects. I would say it's currently one of the most important web projects in the Ruby community. And we have Shoes, which actually intends to be easy for beginners. I haven't included Jekyll. Although it's on GitHub page, the technology powering GitHub pages, it has the hat trick of actually needing all of those 3 environments to be able to just run the sample page. So why don't we have an installer for all platforms, like a one-click installer? And it boggles my mind that actually Ruby on Windows is far ahead of anyone else in that regard. It's not all gold, but yeah, thanks, Louis. Here's my thanks to Louis. And I've also got some great news for you to quote the last talk. Ruby is actually not that bad as a multi-platform language. It's one of the rare languages that you can use on and off the JVM and some other runtime systems, including the whole environment. Sure, there are JavaScript interpreters on the JVM, but they use the JVM native interfaces. JRuby actually has all the Ruby interfaces, so I can port code between a standard Unix environment and a JRuby environment very easily. And that is an argument that I hear very rarely when it comes to why do we use Ruby. Portability is a really good one. So, where do we go as a language? Where are we? Where do we go? Ruby is a surprisingly stable language on a conceptual level and on a syntactical level. So I have this little piece of code. This is valid Ruby 1.8.0. Possibly most of you have never even seen Ruby before that. That still works. I could implement that back then. I can implement it today. If I understand the concepts between these two pieces of code, I have understood a lot of Ruby already. Compared to another language that usually is called stable, let's see, what has Java added in this time? Generics, enumerators, for each iterators, autoboxing, annotations, static imports, all with new syntax, all with new concepts, all with new things that probably, if you wanted to use them, needs a major re-architecturing of your software. So Ruby is actually, when it doesn't come to API, a very stable thing. If you learned it once, your concepts will be valid for the next time, a few years. And we currently have one big web framework. We have one smaller one. We have a visible field of tools, deployment tools for web applications, some smaller command line tools that are used quite often. And we have a few surprises. A lot of people don't know that, for example, you don't need to install Python and Pigments to get a good code highlighter. CodeRay is actually a very good code highlighter that is written by one of the Pigments initiators. And has any one of you ever heard of RPG Maker? Great. And there's a very large group of Rubyists that came into Ruby because in Japan there is a toolkit for writing large JRPG things. And it's scripted in Ruby. So a lot of people actually started Ruby as a gaming scripting language. And that many people are not aware of. Coming back to growing, I think the Ruby community needs to find ways to grow without Rails. A lot of the growth of the last years has been fueled by Rails, and that's good. But I think this is stopping. It doesn't mean that we should have to throw away Rails, not at all. It is an important part of the community. It will stay. It will be an innovative part of the community, but I think there's space to do things next to Rails. And one of the things, we should detach ourselves a bit. One of the things that I think is really viral in the Ruby community is the usage of active support. It's a large and heavy library that's mostly actually for supporting web applications and not for other kinds. You should consider, if you're starting a new project or a new gem, to not have any dependency on that, even if you need small parts of it. Maybe use a re-implementation. Which brings me to opportunities and some new movements. There's the micro-RB movement. If you haven't heard of it yet, it's the attempt to create a collection of small and composable libraries focused on doing just one thing and only one. For example, a simple validation library or a library that parses a certain file format or something that does some certain string manipulations. And coming back to active support, if you ask the question, would you consider putting class loading logic in the same library as date handling extensions? Would you consider that clean code? Probably not. And on this conference yesterday, we've been all the time talking about modularity. And I think our libraries should follow. We can also imagine a web that doesn't even use rec. There are projects, like, for example, Sean Cribb's web machine, that don't follow the rec request response model for very good reasons. For example, for slow clients and things like that. Definitely have a look at that. And maybe that might be a way to move beyond the Rails part. And we should finally acknowledge that there's a lot of Ruby beyond web. Everyone externally conceives Ruby as being the community about Rails, which is actually not. We have Puppet, we have Chef that are used by huge multinational companies. We have R2, which is a very nice robot control framework. We have Vagrant. Usually, if we go to clients and they're like, we don't use Ruby. Yeah, but you're using Vagrant, right? So it's everywhere. And the advantage of this is, if you are in diverse technology sectors, that means that we have a lot more entry points for new people. You don't need to be a web developer to pick up Ruby. You can also be someone who just wants to build a good build environment for his company. Suddenly you're using Vagrant, suddenly you're using Ruby. And that's the final point. People matter. People matter much more than we say. So where's our community? Any real movement in any sector is driven by some community. So to face it, the first iterations of Ruby were really bad. There has been no technical reason to use Ruby 1.8. It's probably one of the most horrible pieces of software, or the most horrible pieces of a runtime that you have ever used. But there were a lot of nice people caring for it, teaching it, improving it. And let's face another thing. There is actually no Ruby community. If someone says, the Ruby community does, ask him, which one? And that's been for that, like, forever. This is something that I drew for another talk. This is my little connection to the Ruby world. So I have a lot of connections in Germany, Cologne, and Munich. I have friends in Finland. And I have people down here in Uruguay that invited me. Through them, I have some connections to Seattle. The person that introduced me to Ruby is living in China for 10 years now, and he introduced me to the whole Asian Ruby community, which is a community that's completely not visible to the whole American part. And many of these are very healthy and innovative. And the other nice thing about having this kind of fragmented community is it can never be fully broken. So if someone says the Ruby community is broken, please tell me which one. I hear that a lot. It's like, the Ruby community, I don't like them, they're all assholes. Well, who? A lot of people say about the Berlin Ruby community that it's very nice. I found my stay here also very kind. A lot of nice people. And it's very open. It has always been. And there are several reasons for that. The history of Ruby was always about having at least two communities, which was the Asian community with a lot of people that wouldn't actually speak any English, the US community, later moving on to Europe, and down here I'm on a conference where we need live translation. And that's good. We're one of the rare communities where having to speak English is not necessary. And we always had to share our space because Python was already there, Perl was already there. So Ruby was definitely never a first mover in the space that it occupied. And many Rubyists come from other languages, so they have previous experience and are kind of more grown up, I think, in that respect. And today we're on the forefront of changing development communities. We have projects like Rails Girls, a Ruby project. Open Text School is a Python project. Nodecopter is a very nice thing where Node.js people get together. And all of those, if they want to Coder Dojo, which are courses for kids to learn programming, which are not attached to any of those languages, but often fueled by those communities. And through that, we have found ways to actually speak to new people. So to bring new people into development and to bring new people into Ruby. And the greatest opportunity that we have is we can create more space. And this space will be filled by people. So let's create it. Let's have more community meetings. Let's make them more local. Let's make them smaller. Make them non-English. Make them cross-interest. If you don't have enough Rubyists in town, make it a Ruby Pythonist meeting. That's close enough. Why not? Do it in unorganized formats. That doesn't always have to be a talk. Sit together in a room for a day and hack. We need more people getting new people in. Find new ways of encouraging people. This year at Eurocamp, we had the decision at the beginning that we don't want to invite any speakers, that we don't want to have Steve Klabnik on stage, that we don't want to have any well-known Rubyists on stage. And figured out that maybe we could try to find people that would help other people to go on stage. And conceive the mentorship program where every new speaker, every speaker at our conference gets someone assigned that helps them preparing their talk. And it's working out great. Let's make those spaces safe and diverse. And I felt that I need to add a lot of slides to this and make it a whole other talk. But I'm lucky. I can make that quick. Let's reiterate what Fernando said and what Michael said this morning. It's been very good. Thank you, too. And we should move into other communities. One question I get a lot last year was, Steve is moving to Rust. Yehuda is looking into Rust as well. A lot of Rubyists are interested in other things. Why not? It's very good. They've had a lot of experience in our community. They're moving on. But they're still self-identifying as Rubyists. And that's very important because Ruby will always be in their list of tools. And they will use it quickly if they need something. So if you want to do Rust, Go, Elixir, do it. It's very great. Because one of the things that I've always found interesting about Ruby was the curiosity. We have people on stage talking about closure. Why not? Because in the end, Rubyists want to code Ruby or turn any other language into Ruby. Thank you.